Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, and I'm the events manager at Politics and Prose, and I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. A couple things before we start. At any time during the event, you can click the green button below on the bottom of your screen to purchase tonight's book, and it goes straight to our website. And we're currently offering free shipping on all orders, so feel free to stock up. All 3 of our physical store locations are now closed, so we need your online purchases more than ever so that we can keep bringing you events just like this. You can also ask our speakers a question by clicking the Ask a Question also on the bottom of your screen. And you can ask that for anyone on screen, and you can read other people's questions and then vote on the ones that you would like to see answered the most. So feel free to start doing that at any time tonight. All right, on to tonight's event. Michael Chabon is a best-selling and Pulitzer Prize-winning author, screenwriter, columnist, and co-editor of the book we'll be discussing tonight. Some of my personal favorite books of his include The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, Wonder Boys, and The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. Ayelet Waldman is a novelist, essayist, and the other co-editor of tonight's book, Fight of the Century. She is also a former federal public defender and an adjunct professor at the UC Berkeley Law School, where she developed and taught a course on the legal implications of the war on drugs. And last but certainly not least is Monica Hopkins, the executive director of the ACLU-DC. She's also a Rockwood Institute LGBT Advocacy Fellow and currently serves on the board of the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens. So now it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Michael Chabon, Ayelet Waldman, and Monica Hopkins to P&P Live.
Thank you.
Hello. So nice to meet you. Nice to see everyone.
Monica.
And here we are, coming frame. There we are. We need to see ourselves to know we're in frame, whether we're in frame. Yeah, well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk since we had to cancel our in-person.
I know, such a bummer.
But I'm glad that we can do this.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, how about if we start just by just generally talking about how the book came about and, how did such an amazing collection of authors and stories sort of develop?
Well, it all started right at literally election day. When it became clear what was happening, I texted a good friend of mine, James Essex, who works for the ACLU, who's the head of the Gay and Lesbian Rights Project, I believe. And I said, James, if you need a couple of literary novelists for anything, we're here. We'll do whatever we can because we know we can trust you guys.
iPads.
Yeah. So James said, well, funny you should say that because I really, I saw that book you guys did about the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And why don't you think about doing something like that? So that book was called Kingdom of Olives and Ash, and we collected a couple dozen writers, brought them to Israel and to Palestine, and they wrote about what they saw. And it's a really beautiful collection. And he asked us to do sort of something similar. What we didn't realize is that literally everybody we would ask would say yes to participate in the book. So we put this together. It's backwards. Fight of the Century, and we just started asking people right away, would you write an essay? Would you, pretty quickly, James and I believe, or maybe Stacy, Stacy Sullivan, this incredible, wonderful woman who used to work for the ACLU in the press department. Stacy and I came up with this idea that we would take seminal ACLU cases going back all the way to the beginning of the founding of the organization, and we would have novelists, some essayists write about them, maybe write an essay that was about your personal experience dealing with the issue of the case, or maybe imagine yourself back into the facts of the case and write the facts of the case. And it was so easy to get people to join. I mean, and the list,
everybody wanted, and people. One of the fun things was the writers who came to us already knowing which case they wanted to write about. They immediately, maybe because they had studied the case themselves already, or else they had some really strong personal connection. We had a number of writers who are in interracial marriages, and so the Loving versus Virginia case was immediately of interest to some of them.
Or like Jackie Woodson, who is an incredible National Book Award-winning novelist, immediately knew that she wanted to write about the Scottsboro Boys, or Muriel Rothman-Zecher, who's a young novelist, really talented. He lived near Skokie, and so he wanted to write about those cases. He wanted to write about what happens, what sort of to help us understand why the ACLU supported those people who wanted to march, the Nazis who wanted to march through a Jewish neighborhood. So it was really wonderful to see how that kind of shook out with people choosing their cases. We never, every once in a while when we had doubles, we would say, is there any other case that appeals to you? But mostly people just picked the things that were, closest to their heart.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the book too is that each sort of essay starts with just a really brief sort of like description of the case. So it sort of contextualizes, because some of the stories are sort of directly related. Some of them are interpretations. Some of them are, how the author themselves sort of connects.
So those were all written. If you look in the acknowledgments, you can see their lists of their law students. So those little blurbs that are up in the front of the case, I reached out to some friends who were law professors at Harvard and at UC Berkeley, and I said, can you find me law students who might be interested in participating in this project? And we had so many of them. It was really incredible. These young people who sort of took the time to do the legal research and figure out what the case is about, and to how to summarize it, how to understand it, and they were terrific. It was a really great group of young law students. We couldn't have written those things without them. We absolutely couldn't.
So what are some of the connecting themes you noticed amongst all the essays?
Connecting themes.
Well, I mean, typically, maybe this isn't the case with every case in the book, but typically in the landmark cases, the major cases that the ACLU has taken on over the past century, there's something really challenging in the narrative of the case itself. They're typically not cut and dry, easily interpreted. They raise thorny questions. They ask, the court, they ask us to sort of balance competing interests in ways that are sometimes less than obvious. I mean, the Skokie case is such a classic example of that. And, and when Ayelet and I were talking about our own experience with the ACLU, I think this would be true of many people of our generation. We each had sort of first come into cognizance of what the ACLU was, and even more specifically what it does in that case, where it on the surface,
Brandenburg.
Where it seems so obvious, where it's like, well, Nazis are bad, right? I mean, I was 14 years old or something, so why would the ACLU be representing Nazis? And you had to go deeper into the question and look at those First Amendment rights. And I think that is, sometimes that's less true with some of these cases, like the internment, the Japanese.
Yeah, that's
I mean, like some of them are kind of cut and dry.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, in particular, it's appalling and shocking that these cases even had to be argued at all. But at least I think for some of them, there is that amazing, complicated thing that is, the Constitution, that is sometimes very challenging to interpret.
For me, what I'm always amazed by is how civil rights attorneys, and specifically the ACLU, are ahead of society. They have a truer moral compass than the rest of us, and that they see this kind of the ramifications of what we're doing and the possibilities of what we can become, which is why I always say that, to my mind, the ACLU, the NAACP, organizations like this, they're the most patriotic Americans. The ACLU is the most patriotic American organization, because the ACLU holds the Constitution to its most perfect standard. And they, unlike, for example, 5 of the current justices in the United States Supreme Court, really see what this document and this nation can be at its best. So for us to participate in this project at this moment in time is a way of saying, so what you see the Nazis marching and killing people in Charlottesville, what you see people, strapping on their massive guns and walking through schoolyards, what or Walmart or wherever with their open carry, what you see with people on social media being so horribly ugly and trolling, that's not all America is. There is an America that we should be patriotic toward and that we can feel proud of belonging to. And that America is in fact the majority. That America won the popular vote. And that America has a potential that we can't abandon, no matter how terrible the situation is, and no matter how it seems like that anti-patriotic, that ugly American attitude, even if it seems like it's winning, it's really not. In the end, I do believe that that our union does get more perfect, even if we have terrible
setbacks.
I always, I think about the Constitution a lot for obvious reasons, but I've always thought of it as, a document that outlines sort of the American imagination, of what we could be. And the tension is sort of between our reality on the ground, and that what we're trying to do is sort of make that more perfect union and
right.
live out that imagination.
It's a constant struggle. I mean, and I think that's another theme that emerges throughout the pieces in this book, is that it is a constant struggle, and that the ACLU and its lawyers and staff the fight's never over. It's for the past, I mean, that's why we put the word fight in the title. It is a constant, never-ending battle. And the thing that you get from these pieces, especially with pieces that are written about the various attorneys that tried the case and argued the case in front of the Supreme Court, et cetera, is the relentlessness of it, the untiringness, that the sometimes you're reading these pieces and you're just like, I got exhausted sometimes. Then there was another round of it, and they got, this ruling didn't go in the right way, and they had to do it all over again. And yeah.
I mean, that's what was so inspiring to us, that the first thing the ACLU said after the election was, see you in court. And you guys have been fighting tooth and nail over and over and over again, without stopping, without you get disheartened for a moment and then you're back up, like what? When you punch and it comes a weeble, you wobble, but you
don't fall down.
Well, I really think it's inspiring, and it's what keeps being able to do this project and to celebrate these 100 years of incredible fortitude and struggle. What makes us feel like a part of it, and that's been really exciting for us.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask. There's a comment and a question. Just to remind folks, you can click on Ask a Question, and your questions will pop up. One of the comments from someone was that their father was the lawyer in Times versus Sullivan, the case.
No way!
He and his father disagreed was Skokie. His father was the founder of the National Lawyers Guild, and he never would have become a member of the ACLU, but he suggested that his son become a member of the ACLU.
Why not? Wow.
Because of Skokie?
Because of Skokie.
But he went to the National Lawyers Guild, which I bet came down the same way as the ACLU on that issue. I would have to look that up, but given Guild is amazing. Another incredible organization.
Yeah, and one of the things I loved about sort of the book was the inclusion not only of cases that were the ACLU's case where they were lead counsel, but also the cases where we were amicus in those cases. And so what was really interesting about that was showing how the collaboration between all of these groups in a way to sort of lead a movement and change.
Sometimes the Supreme Court opinion itself comes out of the amicus briefs. I mean, that's not the ones so an amicus brief, for those of you who don't know, is it's a friend of the court brief. It's, let's say you are bringing suit against a state that's limiting abortion rights. So amicus might be, friends of the court might file a brief, say the American Medical Association might file a brief that says abortion rights are a medical practice. We need to keep these free and accessible to the public, legal. We need to refrain from imposing undue restrictions, or in the case of the trap laws, these laws about what an abortion clinic has to have, these don't make any sense from a medical perspective. You might have some women's organizations, you might have domestic violence organizations. So all of these friends of the court file these opinions, and then when you're adjudicating as a judge, often those amicus briefs are as, or if not more important than the actual briefs of the parties. So when the ACLU acts as amicus, and we chose to include those cases because we felt that when the ACLU acted as an amicus, they were as much part of that ultimate decision and as a part of the litigation process as had they been, representing the individual plaintiff or defendant.
So one of the questions that I love that explanation. One of the questions that's being asked is, what was the most surprising thing you learned as you were collecting these stories from the various contributors?
Well, I'll tell you one story that was surprising, and it was also kind of awesome. It says everything you need to know about this process. So when we asked Scott Turow to participate, Scott said, "Oh, hell yeah, I'm going to participate. And not only am I going to participate, I am going to write about Buckley versus Valeo, which is the case that essentially the cascade of cases led to Citizens United." And he said, "And the ACLU this up, and if they hadn't been on the wrong side of this, none of this shit would have happened." And he wrote this very impassioned, great essay, basically taking the ACLU to task on this issue. And we loved getting it, but I thought, all right, we better just call Anthony Romero and just let him know it's coming. And the executive director of the ACLU National, and we were like, I don't know, is he going to say anything? We'll see. And he was thrilled. He and David Cole, the litigation director, they were like, it's a book for it couldn't be an ACLU book if it didn't include at least one essay attacking the ACLU. Yeah. And a friend, when we were doing one of the events, where was it? In Boston. The executive director of the Massachusetts ACLU said that there's a saying that if you disagree with the ACLU half the time, you're a member, and if you disagree with the ACLU 90% of the time, you're on the board of directors. It felt very appropriate. So that was a great moment. And, I don't know, man, I think Scott Turow convinced me, so I think y'all screwed that up.
What was curious, though, was the review in the New York Times that took this book to task for not talking about Buckley
versus Valeo, and we're just like, hello.
The review was about.
It was so
Did you read it?
To show that reviewers don't it. I mean, that she was just like, yeah, okay, good, I got it.
See the words Citizens United.
I know, it was so deeply ignorant. It was very satisfying because usually as a novelist, you feel that way about a bad review, but you can't actually make your point because people have opinions.
It's an interpretation.
It's an interpretation, and you can't. But now it's just like, oh, really?
Right. It's right there.
So it was otherwise very good review, I have to say. It was
We're
very.
not complaining.
The book has gotten amazing reviews, which is only just since, we have the most, there's Jesmyn Ward, Marlon James, Scott Turow, Neil Gaiman, Dave Eggers, Salman Rushdie, Geraldine Brooks,
Anthony Doerr.
It's got the most incredible writers writing today.
George Saunders, did you say
George Saunders. And also has an incredible diversity of voices, races, colors, ages, genders.
Parts of the country.
It's really, we're really proud of that. And that, we basically just asked people whose writing we loved. And when you do that, when you're making an anthology and you collect the work of the people you think are the best writers, you get true diversity. That's what happens.
Yeah, and I felt like the writers also, they're, as I said, some of them were, a lot of them are my favorite writers, and having a little insight into their lives. They seem to really realize these cases and how they affected them because of their families or because of their personal experiences, and had sort of bumped up against law in their real lives, which is really wonderful. One of the other questions, since it's about one of the writers, is someone says, I'm a card-carrying member of the ACLU. I will thank you for that. And a huge fan of Neil Gaiman. Can you tell the story of how he got involved in this book? And are any of you involved with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund?
So Neil is a dear friend of ours. In fact, he and his wife Amanda got married in our house, which was totally an accident. I didn't remember telling them they could do that. He called one day and was like, it is so lovely of you, Ayelet, to welcome us and host the wedding in your front room. Great! And
Yes. You better get some tacos.
I don't know, it was like 5 days later, we had an amazing wedding. So we've known Neil for a long time, which is why, and he's sort of like our kids. He's their beloved uncle. So that's why I don't think he could say no. But also he's a huge civil libertarian and supporter of all causes like this. And so it was a natural for him. What about the Comics Defense Fund? Are you involved in that too?
I've given them money over the years. Whenever one of their appeals kind of crosses my email inbox, their more urgent appeals, I've written checks over the years. Yeah.
So just a reminder to folks, you can ask a question by clicking the Ask a Question, but since we don't have any in the queue, I actually
look, here comes some questions.
Well, let's yours first while we collect some.
While we collect some. Were there any particular challenges in explaining the legal cases to a literary audience?
Well, because the essays they're not legal essays, right? They're really personal. And even the ones that are not exactly personal are essays, they're written for a reader who is not an attorney. So I don't think so. Sometimes there were occasional writers who really wanted to get the law down well. Like George Saunders did a tremendous amount of research and actually worked with an ACLU lawyer to make sure he understood all the ramifications of what he was writing about. And that was really marvelous to see him go through that whole sort of really learning process. It's the way George does everything, but it was really marvelous to see.
I had some moments when writing the one on Ulysses. There were some complicated issues of jurisdiction, whether it was the New York Supreme Court of New York.
Well, that's
the lower court, right?
Court of Appeal.
And then there was the Court of Appeals, and then there was also this question of the in rem, the reason that case is known as the People versus One Book called Ulysses is because you could actually charge an object with a crime and it's like an aspect of maritime law, I guess. So anyway, to try to get to understand those some quite fundamental legal concepts, but that are also abstruse.
Not maritime, but yes. It's okay.
No, the in rem. Yeah.
In rem, it's not just maritime. But let's not be too dull about it.
Those
This
things.
is a customs, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those, and you got some help understanding those, right? Didn't you?
I just
Powered through.
had to use the internet.
Yeah. I mean, so, we put the little blurbs like we were talking about up front so that if you wanted to really understand what the case itself was about. But the idea of this book was that you didn't have to be a lawyer. You didn't have to care about the law, even to get some joy and interest out of the various essays. And some of them are just deeply, deeply personal that have very almost, it's only in the reading of them that you realize sort of how it relates tangentially.
Mm-hmm.
I really, one of the things that struck me in reading was Ann Patchett's about Edwards versus California. And it just seemed so interesting that, the book came out right before our current coronavirus situation.
Right.
And, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, it basically describes the case of two brothers. Mr. Edwards had driven from California to Texas to bring his brother, I think brother-in-law.
Mhm.
The idea was that during the Great Depression, the state of California didn't want poor people during the Dust Bowl coming.
Okies.
They didn't want Okies coming and being a drain on the resources of the state of California. So they made a law saying you can't knowingly transport an indigent person over the border into the state of California. And then you had this family and this woman's brother who was struggling terribly, and they wanted to bring him and, bring him to them and to take care of him. I wonder how that could work.
Mm-hmm.
And he was charged with violating this law. And so it was so interesting because I studied Edwards versus California in law school. It never occurred to me to think through the emotional ramifications of that then. And Anne's essay really brings that home. I mean, she talks about she makes you feel what it's like to be, in this family and to have a family member, it's within the state of California, but on Saturday, I am getting in my car with my mask and my gloves and my cleanser and everything I need. And I am driving down to Southern California to get our son and to bring him up to Northern California to stay with us for as long as this lasts. He's in a house in Southern California with his girlfriend, and I'm bringing them both home. And it really struck me that that's exactly what this case was about. That's exactly what Edwards did. He went to get his brother-in-law and bring him to where he could be safe. And that was illegal until the case. So the ACLU brought this case.
And I love how in that essay, she really, we have this notion too that the courts are sort of this institution that's insulated from everything going on and makes these completely objective decisions. But she points out in particular that, the Grapes of Wrath came out the year before the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Mr. Edwards.
Right.
Which is this interesting, The Grapes of Wrath is just such an emotional book. And,
and it was an incredibly important book at the time. And, it won the Pulitzer Prize. And I think it really made it possible for people to understand the subjective experience of the, people who were suffering and the Okies and people who came. So I'm sure, there are these kind of two schools of thought in law, which is that the courts act as this kind of neutral body and that they interpret the Constitution, which is a set in stone. And there's also this this school of thought that accepts the idea that individuals are affected by all sorts of things in their own, and by society and by bias and by the changes in society, and that the judges are just like everybody else in that way, and that they interpret cases. They can't separate their own individual experiences and biases in the interpretation of cases. And but you can guess which theory I subscribe to. And I would argue one that's obviously correct. And I would argue that you see that every minute in the current Supreme Court, which is, contorting itself to come to again and again and again rule in this way that is so dogmatically conservative. You know, these are justices that pretend that they are committed to these legal concepts, and they don't reject the notion of a constitution as a living document, except one of the most important concepts in American jurisprudence is stare decisis, which means if a decision is made, that decision has tremendous weight, and they just turn things over.
The abortion.
Right, they'll overturn things even if the decision was made 5 minutes ago, because they're driven by a very clear political agenda that has nothing to do with law. I mean, you know, for example, this is a court made up of many, many Catholics, bizarrely disproportionate, and it's made up of men, bizarrely disproportionate, and conservatives, bizarrely disproportionate, and they are opposed on some deep, fundamental, personal level to abortion. And so they're tying themselves in knots to reject these deep constitutional jurisprudential concepts like stare decisis in order to achieve the rulings they want. So anyway, that's just kind of I'm like putting on my law professor hat. Let's get some questions, which we'll probably
do. I think we've gotten people.
Yeah, look at all those questions.
So the first question is, what perspective did you gain by bringing authors and writers to the table on ACLU cases? And did you find it made the topics more digestible or approachable to someone who doesn't necessarily have a legal background?
I would hope so. I mean, that was ultimately the goal, was by pairing incredibly gifted masters of language who know how to tell stories, who know how to shape narrative, find narrative in places where sometimes maybe the narrative's a little bit buried, and bring that out and get it across in a way that once you've read the piece, you know, you have a clear sense of what it was all about, or what it would mean to somebody who was in the circumstances of the defendant in the case, or whatever it is. So, you know, that's what we were hoping for, to just try to, you know, let great writers shine their light on some of these incredibly important, but often poorly understood or insufficiently studied landmark cases.
Yeah, some of them, I mean, I work for the ACLU, and obviously I read all of the landmark cases. But I so appreciated the explanation that folks gave, and the personalization. And what was interesting to Michael is your piece about Ulysses really touched on, you said something just now about bringing these gifted authors who have the tool of the narrative and that sense of creativity. And what I loved about your piece too is you sort of unraveled the creativity that even lawyers have in this argument.
Yes, I mean the story of the Judge Woolsey's ruling in the Ulysses case is the story of an incredible feat of legal craft.
Tell the story about how it came about.
What came about?
How the case came about.
Oh, well, you know, I'm now, of course, I'm blanking on his name, Maurice
Ernst.
Ernst, thank you. You know, Maurice Ernst had already had an interest in obscenity law, and had been the attorney in a number of cases, especially in New York, in which various kinds of books had been seized and burned by customs, and so this was something he had been engaged in, a fight he had been engaged in for many years, and in many ways, Ulysses' case was kind of not just a personal culmination or a career culmination, but it was something he had been carefully laying the groundwork for years, getting to know the ins and outs of the New York system, knowing all the judges, and collaborating with friends who wrote laws, who actually were the people who, you know, write the laws for Congress, the various acts that are passed and so on, so that when a new Customs Act was being crafted in the United States Congress, he managed through this friend to get this clause inserted years ahead of the Ulysses case that would allow the Postmaster General, I think, to make an exception in the case of an individual book being brought into the country if that official determined that the book was a work of art. So, and then he did nothing with that language, and he just left it there till he needed it, and then he needed it in the Ulysses case. And he had it all planned out. It was almost like a heist, in a heist film. Like he had Confederates, and he had people, your role is to do this, and your role is to do that. And one of his Confederates was sort of this innocent, almost like a patsy in a way, was just this guy who was a friend of another lawyer in the case who was coming from Germany to the United States, or maybe coming from France to the United States. And they said, go to Shakespeare and Company in Paris, the publisher of Ulysses and the only actual legally licensed seller of the book at that time. Buy a copy, put it in your luggage, come to the United States. When you go through customs, it will be seized, and then our case will be able to go. We'll have the seizure will happen, and we'll be able to launch this case. So the guy comes over to America. He's on the cruise ship. He has the book in his luggage. He comes into the steamship docks in Brooklyn, and he waits for the book to be seized. He's kind of nervous and wondering what's going to happen, and nobody says anything. And
they're just like,
whatever. They just wave him through. They're like, oh, everybody brings that in here. It was a very kind of it was like
it's like sucking the plot out of the heist movie.
Yes, right, exactly. So then the guy's like, what do I do now? And he showed up at Random House where he had officially been told the book was going to be taken. He was like, okay, here's your book. Like, we don't want this. We want it to be seized. And so Maurice Ernst actually took that book and went back down to the docks and started just, buttonholing customs officials until he found one who was willing to seize the book and take it into custody, so that he could then bring the case and try to get the ruling that he had, in many ways had already sort of determined beforehand which judge it should be and which courts it should go through and how they are going to use all these other provisions of the law to support it. And it just it was like a heist, except for that one snafu. It really did come off like clockwork. So, I had always been interested in that case. I've said many times, I've reread, that's one of my favorite books, and I've reread it many times. And up until the mid to late 1980s, every copy of Ulysses published in the United States included Judge Woolsey's ruling right up front. And so I had read Judge Woolsey's ruling many, many times. And it's a wonderful ruling. It's brief, it's pithy, it's really well written, it's funny, it's charming, and it's correct. And he knew he was doing something great and important, and he was a little proud of himself. And I knew what I knew about the case just from that, really. And so it was really a surprise for me once I just decided to write about this, to discover what an incredibly great story it actually turned out to be. And so the piece that I wrote is really, more than anything else, just a piece of narrative history. It's just sort of telling the story of the story. And and there's such a wealth of colorful characters: Bennett Cerf and Ernst and Judge Woolsey and James Joyce and Sylvia Beach, the incredibly brave bookseller who was the only person that was willing to take all the risks involved in publishing Joyce's masterpiece. So it would make a great movie.
I know that Michael is running, and he's like, I think we should do this.
Between Joyce and Beach and then
so
trial.
Good. I just have to point out that when I was typing and I got us into this thing, I wrote Ayelet and Mikale.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I've changed it. Yeah.
Sorry.
There you go.
Mikale Chabon.
So, Ayelet, the piece that you chose to write about, the O'Connor versus Donaldson piece,
yes.
This is one of the questions that has popped up, and I was interested in it as well. Could you describe sort of, why you chose that piece, what the basis for that case was? And, it seems like there are a lot of parallels now between that case, our current incarceration crisis, and even where we are now with sort of dealing with jails and prisons and the current coronavirus.
Right. So that is the case that established that you can't just hold someone indefinitely in a psychiatric facility forever. You can only hold someone if they are a danger to themselves or others. So it was this notion that you had to prove and continue to prove over and over again that an individual was dangerous to themselves or others before you can detain them. And the idea, this was, again, finding a case that could establish this, finding a way to work on behalf of the release of so many people who were incarcerated in really brutal psychiatric facilities at the time, was something that attorneys who worked for the ACLU were very, they were eagerly looking for a case to work on this issue. And could you do something about that while I talk about this? Could you turn the dryer off? Sorry. Yeah, no, I think it's the washing machine or the dryer. Yeah, there's a lot of housework involved, it turns out, we all know. Anyway, so basically you had this individual who was, had spent just forever, years after year after year after year after year after year in a psychiatric facility. And there's no doubt that he had a mental illness. There's no doubt, reading as a person who's in 2020, that he's bipolar, that he had periods of mania and paranoia and grandiosity and all those sort of typical hallmarks of a bipolar person. But there was also no doubt that he simply wasn't dangerous, and that he actually, what he had was, he had engendered great animus on the part of initially his doctor and the person who ended up running the psychiatric facility. And it was a really important case in terms of what it established, this kind of notion of that even people with psychiatric illnesses are entitled to personal autonomy and liberty. But also the idea behind this case wasn't that we would just shut down psychiatric facilities and release everybody into homelessness. The idea was supposed to be that we would establish this, in the very beginning, there was an idea that we would establish a right to treatment. And we would say that if you have a mental illness, you have a right to be treated, and you have a right to not be incarcerated indefinitely. But the way that things played out, we ended up the court did not find a right to treatment. But they just found this sort of individual liberty that entitled you to be released. And that's what we ended up happening was there was a tremendous number of people released from long-term hospitalization, but there was the hoped for community infrastructure that would have allowed these people to be treated in their own homes, to be treated as part of the community, to have outpatient psychiatric care simply never materialized, because it turns out in America we don't actually care about people like that very much. So in the years since, we've seen tremendous numbers of mentally ill people experiencing homelessness. The prisons have become a de facto nationwide psychiatric infrastructure, because people who have mental illness end up in prison. People who have addiction issues end up in prison. So the prisons, which are sort of the least capable of places to deal with people, the least focused on mental health and rehabilitation and nurturing and the support that you need if you're a person with a mental illness, have become where we are treating people with mental illnesses. So for me, it was personally an important case because I have a mood disorder. And I have cycled, not in the same way, and I have not been hospitalized, but I cycle between depression and hypomania, and understanding what might have happened to me absent the role of the ACLU in establishing this kind of right to personal liberty was really important. I mean, had that not happened, it's very possible that I would find myself, like many people, in kind of permanent psychiatric incarceration without any opportunity to work on effective treatment in my home, in the community, as part of my family. And it was chilling to realize that, and scary to realize that. But also, it was important for me also to realize, I felt this kind of personal anxiety always around the sort of homeless, mentally ill, a a vague feeling of threat. And when I was writing this essay, I realized that really what I was afraid of is the notion that they were too close to a reflection of what could have happened to me, and that discomfort and that sometimes even disgust was really just
Fear.
Was an expression of fear, and overcoming that fear it's been a challenge, but a really important thing to do.
That sort of personalization and recognition of others in these cases is sort of prevalent through the book, through all of these authors' pieces too. The piece about the Scottsboro boys really sort of hit me from the opening lines about going to see the Scottsboro boys play and having a coughing fit because just something wasn't sitting right, and the ending line of pulling the Scottsboro boys forward to sort of the police violence that we see today, and those closing lines of, but we'll all just sing and dance. We'll all just sing and dance.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
she's a remarkable writer, Jacqueline Woodson. She has this capacity to take a historical moment, sometimes it's a political theory, sometimes it's a historical moment, and to personalize it in a way that gives you, and to make it at once poetic and incredibly personal. She's like unlike many. I mean, she's one of a kind.
Yeah. The book is, sort of all of the touchstone cases of the ACLU. It's this year is the 100th anniversary of the ACLU, and I wonder, and this is one of the questions, when thinking about these cases and talking to the writers, did any of the writers talk about what the future role of the ACLU might be, or contemplate, has it changed, or what did both of you think about the role of the ACLU in this?
In a way, it seems the answer to that seems so obvious. I mean, Ayelet, already mentioned the day after the election in the ACLU saying, "See you in court." I mean, we've never needed the ACLU more. They are so deep in the trenches right now on immigration, on abortion. I'm certain there must be all kinds of issues that are starting to bubble up now around coronavirus in various aspects of civil liberties and coronavirus. I mean, we're just, I think another sort of thread that emerges in looking at these pieces in the book, one after the other, is you just keep having a feeling of like, why do we keep needing the ACLU? Like, why do so many of our leaders, our elected officials, our community leaders, what is so threatening in the Constitution that makes it come under attack over and over and
What's
over
so
again?
scary about democracy?
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing that right now with Donald Trump having a full-on public nervous breakdown about the prospect of mail-in voting. Why? Because when people are allowed to vote by mail, they vote more because they can do it over a longer period of time. They can do it from the comfort of their own house. They don't have to wait for 7 hours with other people who are, ill with COVID-19. And he even had a moment where he said, Republicans will lose if, I don't remember what the exact quote was, but the summary was, if we allow too many people to vote, the Republicans will lose because we are not a majority in this country. And these issues, they just never stop. They never stop being as important as they were, I don't know how long ago, for 100 years ago, for the last 100 years, and before that too. Would you open the door for the dog? She now wants to go out again.
It's really.
It's wonderful. When my first book came out, I had a baby who was breastfeeding, and I went on book tour with a breastfeeding baby, and I would just sometimes I just had to nurse during an event because she'd be screaming. that was not quite like it is now, but I have a dog who wants to go out.
Yeah, and things are changing for all of us. I just, as you,
I have a question for you. Like, what are you into right now? What issue or case or?
That it's really interesting as we look into sort of the world we're in right now. Some of the things seem like tragic silver linings, almost. Mass incarceration has been something that the ACLU has been working on for a number of years. And when we're told we can't, how quickly things can change.
Right.
And we all of a sudden have political creative imagination to start saying, okay, let's get people out of cages. Let's figure out how we can get people out. So here in DC, we have sued the DC jail. They have about over 100 people in quarantine right now. They have upward of 18 cases of COVID in the jail. DC has a really interesting system. So we have a jail, we don't have a prison. So our, felonies are prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and people also go away to BOP facilities across the United States. And here in DC, we also have federal halfway houses that are run by the BOP. So, we also, within 1 week, sued both the DC jail and the halfway house for the same reasons. But looking on the horizon, when we start looking at things like contact tracing and the government going to people's homes and taking temperatures of people and developing databases. Since you were in Boston, I think the way the Massachusetts affiliate sort of looks at that as saying avoiding dystopia, like how do we avoid dystopia?
Right.
But we would say that surveillance piece, really concerns us, because what do you do once you give government that power? How else is government going to use that power? Because once it's given, it's very hard to take away.
They never give it back.
Yeah. So, so our work, our work continues in a different way, but in the same way. And I have heard from folks, especially in this moment as things are being uncovered, that what is happening is all of these systemic things that we know about, and we sort of fight in the courts and lobby in state legislatures to change systems writ large, are being exposed. So now part of the dialogue is, what about the sort of disparities that we are seeing in healthcare in the country so very, very clearly, and how do we talk about race disparities and
healthcare? I mean, I think the shocking disparity, racial disparity in fatalities. I think it reveals the difference in healthcare and access to healthcare. It reveals the difference in toxicity of environment. We have environmental racism in this country, and that surely has something to do with why people are more susceptible to more fatal illnesses. I mean, it reveals the disparity of income, because it's not just health. It's not only access to health. It's, can you afford to shelter in your house? Do you have a job that allows you to avoid exposure? I mean, it's just so. It's like an object lesson in the anti-egalitarian American society, which it's heartbreaking.
Shameful.
Utterly shameful. And and it kills me that we have a government that seems, a federal government that is incentivized to ignore that, because those aren't their voters.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the answers from public health officials of, well, we have known there's been a public health disparity for a long time, when actually it's it sort of institutionalized racism.
Yeah.
That's many things that
Exactly.
this to happen
Mhm.
in our policies and practices. So I will ask one more question, and then I will turn it back over to Politics and Prose. So you're being asked if both Michael and Ayelet can respond. Well, let me ask two questions, see if we can sneak them in. If both Michael and Ayelet can respond individually, which essay resonated with you the most?
Oh, I'll start. The one that it
one
was,
that you have it open to right now.
that's mine.
Oh,
So-
mind you.
Really?
Mhm.
No, we'll do both. So Sergio de la Pava, who's a remarkable American novelist and also a public defender in the Bronx, wrote an essay about Gideon versus Wainwright that is, it's exquisitely beautiful. It's heartbreaking. It's funny.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's so knowledgeable.
and as a former public defender, that one really touched me. I mean, I feel like it allowed people to understand. I think that every law professor of first year constitutional criminal law, this is how you teach Gideon, because it's a joy to read, but it really makes you understand the intricacies of that case and the intricacies of the issue and what it means to be what it means to have a lawyer when your lawyer is overburdened by too many cases and working in a system that's inherently biased against you, and doing their absolute best and doing an incredible job, but under impossible circumstances. So I think that's really the essay that I won't say I have a favorite, but that one is really
George Saunders too.
That's one is really a remarkable one for me personally. You want to talk about George Saunders?
I mean, everything that George writes is wonderful. And I think Ayelet was talking about the research that he did. Like how seriously George took this this charge to present a somewhat complicated issue and get it right. And that emphasis that he has on getting it right, and this is a case involving what was then the INS and an immigrant. There's something so careful and thoughtful and measured and in his approach, and yet, like as with all of his writing, just underneath that surface is this incredible reservoir of feeling of outrage or of sympathy, and of even to extend sympathy to the less sympathetic players in a case or a story too. It's sort of an all-encompassing willingness to attempt to understand, and I think that's such a hallmark of his work, and you could really feel it in this piece.
Well, I wanted to thank both of you so very, very, very much.
Thank you for,
thanks for doing
you are
what you
busy,
do.
busy.
Yeah.
And we
Yes.
really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I will turn it back over to Politics and Prose.
Well, before we do that, I want to say one thing. So the royalties on this bond, Fight of the Century, all go to the ACLU.
Every penny.
Every penny. Nobody got paid a dime, not us, not the writers. And it also goes to support your local independent bookstore, which it's really hard to be an independent bookstore during a time of pandemic. So
It's always hard.
It's always
even
hard.
harder now.
So there are 100 of you right now. I know many of you bought the book already. I want all of you to buy another copy. And I can say that
That's
because I'm not
Ayelet.
getting paid. Buy another copy. Support your local bookstore. Support the ACLU. Give it as a gift. Give it to your mail carrier who's putting her life on the line. Give it to your Instacart delivery person who's putting their lives on the line. Just buy another copy, and if you already have one, give it away.
And we're offering free shipping, so you can ship it anywhere.
I mean, everyone on this Zoom probably knows what an incredible bookstore Politics and Prose is, what an amazing institution. I mean, it's deserving of our support in the best of times, and now even more so. So please.
Take it away, Brittany.
Thank you so much for saying that. Yes, please donate to the ACLU, either your local chapter or the national chapter. Definitely buy this book. The link is at the bottom. This is such an important conversation, and we could have talked all night, honestly. But I think this book is so vital, especially right now. And so thank you all so much for being here. To our speakers, to our audience. Guys, check out politics-prose.com for any other events. We've got Samantha Irby, we've got Jonathan Karl, we've got Veronica Roth, and Madeline Albright. We've got lots of fun virtual events coming up, lots of great conversations just like this one. So again, thank you all so much for being here. This was so wonderful. And thank you for the work that you do, truly.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.